Welcome to Shaking Up the Weeds with Upwise Capital. We're high from New York, a Ganjapreneur podcast.
Thank you, Owl Piccino, for that amazing introduction. He always does a great job, doesn't he?
Yes. It's good to be back.
It really is. It's good to be back here with you. And we have a great show today with Hirsh Jain, owner of Ananda Strategy. Welcome, Hirsh. How are you?
Doing great. Joe, Jim, thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. And we're just going to start right off. Tell us how you got into the cannabis world and what you're doing with Ananda Strategy and your sort of superhero origin story.
Sure. I mean, how I got into cannabis, I was born and raised in Northern California. So cannabis has always been a big part of the culture that I grew up in. So part of the reason that I work in cannabis is that cannabis has been part of my life for a long time, probably much earlier than it should have been. I grew up in Northern California. I went to Berkeley for college and did a lot of sort of cannabis advocacy work when I was in college. And then I went to law school at Harvard and did the war on drugs. And so I guess that's just a way of saying I've had an academic interest in these issues in cannabis reform for a really long time. So that's part of it. And, before I worked in cannabis, like a bunch of people in their 20s, I did a few different things. I did a lot of strategy consulting work at a consulting firm called McKinsey, which wasn't really a great long-term fit, but just taught me about how to think through different business problems. And then, what I did before cannabis, and I think that helps explain how I got into cannabis, is I joined Airbnb, the company, at a very early stage and just kind of got, a job there at the right time and helped build out their policy team. Like many sharing economy companies, they were exploding in their growth. But we needed to build a legal and regulatory framework around this activity, whether it be Ubers or Airbnb, et cetera. So, I mean, the short story there was I got to travel the world for a few years and negotiate all of the policy agreements around the world. And I had the insight that same skill set could be applicable to cannabis, which is to say, this is a locally regulated activity that's very popular. I'd helped pass a lot of the Airbnb regulations in a lot of cities in the United States and felt I could do the same for cannabis. So there's more I could say, but about like 6 years ago, after doing that for a while and working, California was on the cusp of legalizing adult use sales. I knew I had to jump in. And I mean, the short story is it was the best decision I ever made. That insight that I had about how the skill set was applicable was relevant. And I'll just, I'll conclude by saying, I jumped into space working in government affairs for some of the larger companies at the time. So I helped lead government affairs at MedMen and then at Caliva, which were two of the larger California cannabis operators at the time. And obviously, California and those companies have gone through challenges, but just working for those companies helped me understand the policy environment in a lot of states around the country. And so that's kind of what I do with Ananda Strategy, which is brands and retailers and other operators navigate what is a really challenging environment. So
that's fantastic. I have a Harvard and Berkeley connection as well. I was born in Boston, where Harvard is.
What do you have connections with Harvard?
And Berkeley, I once took some drugs on the campus. So there you go. I feel
we have that in common.
Yes. Yeah, so you understand California better than anybody. You're in California, grew up in California, went to Berkeley. California market is obviously a very compressed market. They're dealing with a lot of challenges, from taxation to ability to get retail stores open, the illegal market, and really just over compliance. What how do they overcome those challenges, and what do you do to help them?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. If we were to identify the challenges, it's kind of the two that you pointed out, Joe, which I would say is a high tax burden and a lack of retail access. And I think many people listening to this will already know this, but just to kind of tick it out, right? California has the highest tax burden in the country, really, when you do the math, between the 15% state excise tax, the local taxes, which aren't capped. In a bunch of other states, there are caps on how you can tax cannabis. Here, cities run wild. They can tax it up to 10%. Our sales tax is one of the highest in the country. There's a bunch of hidden taxes the consumer never sees, but that are applied earlier in the supply chain and that inflate the price of legal cannabis. So it's not rocket science. When you have a state that has a long-standing illicit market and you tax legal cannabis at more than 50%, it's going to be very difficult to compete, right? So that's number one. And then number two, as you pointed out, is the lack of retail access. Again, it's not rocket science, but on a per capita basis, California should have 4,000, 5,000 dispensaries, right? If it were the same as Oregon or Colorado, that's what it would have. But it only has 1,100. And so again, there are huge swaths of the state where you can't buy cannabis legally. That's why the illegal market is so dominant. And not to get too far into numbers here, not only does it have 1,100 when it should have 4,000, but those stores are overwhelmingly concentrated into a very small number of cities. You know, California has about 500 cities, but about 7 of those 500 cities have almost half of the dispensaries in the state. I mean, really think about that, right?
Why is that though? Like, if
Yeah.
the state is so big and there's that many cities, why wouldn't there be more dispensaries? It's a local issue.
It's a local. That's exactly right. So part of Prop 64 that passed gives local cities the ability to ban cannabis businesses, right? And so part of the compromise of Prop 64 is that we gave local jurisdictions the ability to ban cannabis businesses. So that's why there aren't those businesses open across the state. And again, just to get into the numbers, right? Out of the 500 cities, like 70% of them voted for Prop 64. So there is strong grassroots support for legal cannabis, but elected officials sometimes properly calculate, like I have much more to lose from the 10% vocal anti-cannabis minority that's going to run a recall election against me than I do from the 90% of people who aren't really paying attention and are okay with legal cannabis. So local control continues to be a big issue. And I'll say it's good that there are now other states across the country, Minnesota being an example, that have said, hey, if we're going to legalize cannabis, we have to make it accessible. We can't allow
We got a
this
little frozen.
that we can't allow these.
You got frozen for a second.
Yeah, you're frozen for a second.
When you started talking about Minnesota.
Yeah, it's cold in Minnesota. So who's doing it correctly in California and other stabilized market? And what can we really learn from them?
I think there are other states that are doing it well. If the question is who in California is doing well, I could point out a handful of cities, like the city of, there's a bunch of cities across the state that
What about operators, like specific operators in California that are doing well? Because we're a finance company. For us, we see a lot of California operators, and like you're saying, if they're getting taxed at 50%, and then the cost of capital for them to come and get some kind of debt financing to build out their facility is at north of 15%, then to service that debt, also get taxed and run a profitable business is very difficult, right?
Totally.
How there are profitable operators out there, and I know of a few off the top of my head who are fighting these municipalities and fighting the bigger operators and really just pushing a grassroots movement. But there are also some bigger operators out there that are doing very well in California as well. But you see big MSOs running away from California, right? So
Totally.
how do you do well in California, and like what type of operators should these people in California start to emulate and try and run their business similar to these operators that are successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the operators that are succeeding are those that are just kind of navigating those challenges that we just laid out, right? So just through a few of them. California, as many people know, has gone through compression in the past couple of years. So operators that have been able to build out scaled, low cost cultivation have seen success, right, in recent quarters. Probably one of the most prominent examples of that is a company like Glass House, right, that has one of the biggest greenhouses in the world. I know some people don't like them because they're a larger operator, but their cost of production are really quite low, and so that's succeed. So that's one archetype of a successful operator. I think another archetype of a successful operator are retailers that have been able to build scale and pick up and target jurisdictions intelligently. So if I think about the retail operators in California that have done a really effective job at scaling over the past, let's say, a year or two, I think of a company like Catalyst, right? That has,
it's funny you bring up Catalyst and Glass House in the same sentence back to back when they're suing each other. And Elliot is, for me, I love Elliot. I love what he's about, and I love, that it's weed for the people, and he goes into these towns and he fights, and For me, I've been chasing Elliot for years, right, to finance him and help him to grow his business, but you know, he's suing Glass House, saying that they have to be doing something illegally for them to be getting those type of returns. So it's crazy you use those two in the same as your examples.
Sure. Yeah. And
Sure, yeah.
people who are following the California industry know that there's definitely a tussle going on between those two guys for sure.
Yeah.
Actually. But yeah, I think Elliot is a great example, and I'll also highlight a few different examples. But just to stick with Elliot right now, right? Elliot, or Catalyst now has 24 stores open. If you and I were talking a year or 18 months ago, they would have had 10 stores open. So the way in which they've scaled has been awesome. That allows them to build better relationships with brands and get better terms from those brands. They also, you're right that they do, sort of sue cities and sort of take the gloves off. And a lot of that is a lot of fun to watch. They also
he's strategic about it too. He's not just bullying cities. He's a lawyer at heart, right? So he knows what he's doing.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and his partner who runs like a lot of the legal, you're totally right. They have won a lot of really successful licenses as a result of those suits. So that has been really successful. But what they've also done that I've noticed is, sure, they apply for licenses in places, but other times they identify existing independent operators that are having trouble making it work, partner with those operators, bring them under the Catalyst umbrella, utilize the economies of scale. And so that is an asset light way in which they've expanded, which is relevant, right? Given your conversation. Or another operator, one that I work with that I think also does a great job of this is Off the Charts, right? One of the fastest scaling retail operators in California. And again, because of all of this regulatory burden, there are distressed assets that are out there. And so they're able to obtain those assets on the cheap and scale. And maybe one more example, because, you asked for specific examples. An operator that is scaling intelligently, but in a slightly different way, is an Embark, right? So whereas, Elliot and, Off the Charts, they're moving into these crowded jurisdictions and saying, hey, let me pick up these distressed assets and outcompete in this crowded market. A company like Embark is really intelligently identifying the big retail gaps across the state, right? And so that's why they're one of 2 stores open in Fresno. They'll be the only store opening in San Bruno. If folks are from California, they'll know the jurisdictions I'm talking about. And so there's another example of a company that has been like, wait, this is a huge state. This is a country. Let me master the geography of this country and pick up 3-4 retail assets per year.
I like that strategy. We're here in New York where it's very similar, right? You're dealing with local municipalities, especially in Long Island, where I'm from. My brother has a card license, and we were doing the Elliott fight, fighting the municipality, putting them in the newspaper, telling them they have to get rid of their residential zoning restrictions, and we lost. We lost a good fight, but like that's what it takes. It takes finding the one place that no other dispensary has gone into yet and winning in that municipality. And it shows, like, for us in New York, there's one dispensary in Long Island. It's called Strain Stars. Strain Stars is doing, they're projected to do $50 to $58 million this year. They're going to be the largest dispensary in New York, if not maybe the largest dispensary in the country. I was there today talking to the owners, and they do, 1,400 customers a day on the weekends. So they are in a great location in a town where there's high net worth income and good disposable income, and they're where nobody else is. There's no illegal shops. They're in a very just good residential zone, where there's a lot of commercial traffic as well. So for us, I think that's the best strategy. Is I always think that the best dispensaries, the ones that are doing 2,500 to 4,000 customers a day, are the ones that are in a legal state with a bordering state right next door that's not legal, and people from the other state drive to you to get their weed. Those are good strategic dispensary locations as well.
Totally. And there's a bunch of great examples. Like Kansas City, Missouri is one of the most successful cannabis economies in the country because of all the prohibition states it borders. There's Ontario, Oregon, which is this small town in Eastern Oregon that has been crushing it for years. So yeah, there's a lot of fascinating examples of that phenomenon.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of news lately about Florida.
Mm.
You know, Florida Supreme Court is reviewing potential November 2024 ballot initiative. Now, can you talk about how that, Florida going adult use will, be the tipping point for the country or even for the cannabis as a whole, possibly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Florida ballot initiative is like one of the two or three most exciting things in cannabis over the next year or so. So, as you mentioned, there's a potential ballot initiative in Florida. If it's on the ballot, it would be on the ballot in November 2024. There are oral arguments in November. Again, not to get too much into the technicalities, but the Florida Supreme Court basically has to review the initiative to ensure that it meets all of its legal requirements. One thing to note is that in Florida, in order for the measure to pass, it has to receive 60% of the vote. So the threshold in Florida is higher than it is in other states. But look, Florida would be huge for all of the obvious reasons. There are 20 million people that live in Florida, right? So if this initiative passes, then we'd be getting close to 2/3 of Americans that live in an adult use state. There's 130 million tourists who go to Florida each year, so more so than the population. Huge sort of tourism driver. Many people may know that a lot of the public multi-state operators have huge footprints in Florida, companies like, I mean, right? So it would be huge for a lot of those operators.
Truly, Verano, all of them. They have
Exactly.
180 plus dispensaries in Florida. It's crazy.
Exactly. And then there's also little things like I have noticed over the past year how many of those MSOs have opened up, particularly in the past 6 months, have opened up dispensaries in the Florida Panhandle, right? So not the Miami part of Florida that you think about, but the Florida Panhandle that is for all intents and purposes part of the Deep South, maybe the most culturally conservative place in America. I mean, what would it say about the status of cannabis if in the most conservative part of America, which is the Florida Panhandle, if you've been there, legal cannabis is available and everybody and their mom from Mississippi and Alabama and New Orleans, right, is driving half an hour into the Panhandle to purchase legal cannabis. So in the
They
same
have
way,
a huge medical program, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. There's 500 dispensaries in Florida. There's 850,000 people registered as part of the medical program. It generates nearly $2 billion in sales as a medical state, which is more than almost all the other adult use states. So that's right. And I'll also say it is breaking our stereotypes about who uses cannabis, right? The people who are using cannabis in Florida, that's a lot of old people, a lot of suburban
Yeah.
people, right? So,
yeah, definitely.
And also Georgia, right? Georgia is allowing pharmacies to sell cannabis now. So it seems like the deep south, what you're talking about, is really changing. Can you explain that? How what's going on with the deep south?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think what's going on in Georgia is really fascinating. I mean, so Georgia recently announced. So Georgia's had a medical program for a long time. Like many medical programs, it's kind of struggled to get off the ground. There's been a bunch of lawsuits, so it's been stuck in the mud for a long time. But recently, Georgia announced that they were going to make medical cannabis available at pharmacies. So there's 120 pharmacies across the state that are going to be carrying these medical cannabis oil products. And 90% of Georgia's population will be within a 30-minute drive of one of these pharmacies. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And to state the
That's
obvious,
game changer. Yeah.
it's the part of normalization of cannabis as medicine. When you're offering it as a pharmacy, you are subtly saying,
Yeah.
no, this is not a drug. This is a medicine. And so, yeah, I think that is really exciting and a sign of a huge cultural change.
Do you think a lot of these things are happening because of the potential, rescheduling?
I think the exciting thing, and look, I won't, mince words. It's been a really hard few years for a lot of people in the cannabis space. I think a lot of these things are independent trends that are acting in combination with one another and are bubbling up to something, right? So you are seeing a bunch of states like considering moving into adult use. We were talking about Florida, Ohio is another example. We are seeing these laboratories of democracy in different states with what's going on in Georgia, right? Or stuff going on in other states. And then there are these conversations at the federal level. So I know that's not a really direct answer, but I see this as all independent expressions of the normalization of cannabis.
Right.
The exciting thing is I think they have the opportunity to like independently collide with one another and give each other strength. And that's what's
That was a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Definitely a
beautiful.
good way to put it. We're obviously tech capital guys, we provide financing for companies and, we're dealing with the equity side. from an investor perspective, what are some things that you would say you are excited about, and you're helping your clients with?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'm excited about, and that's a little separate from what I'm helping my clients with. But what I'm excited about is just kind of what we were saying, which is I think there are three significant trends that are happening. One, a lot of movement at the state level when it comes to adult use legalization, or a lot of these innovation in different states. So I'm very excited about states coming online and little things like Ohio being the 24th state, Pennsylvania and Florida potentially coming online. No matter who the next president is, today about half of Americans live in an adult use state. And whenever that next president is inaugurated, if it's Joe Biden or someone else, it'll probably be closer to 2/3, right? Once Florida and Pennsylvania and Ohio come online. So that's pretty serious. So I'm excited about the state story. I think it makes it more investable. The second thing I'm excited about, I know people are really sick of hearing about safe banking, so I won't really belabor the point, right? But there is the prospect that could move at some point, right, in the near future. And I'm not going to spill more breath going back and forth on it, but that is exciting. And then I think the third thing, and you've heard a million people say this before, is the rescheduling thing is very exciting. Sure, it's fraught with risk and uncertainty, and no one is suggesting it'll be a panacea for the industry's problems, but obviously it could change things from a tax and other perspectives. So to answer your question, that's what I'm excited about. I think these three trends will renew investor interest in the space. And, many of us were around in 2018 and 2019 where we thought we were on the cusp of something and we were proven to be wrong. I think this time we'll be on the cusp of real interest and attention in a way that we thought we were before. So that's what I'm excited about. But in terms of like what I help clients with, much of it is kind of like what you were saying earlier, Joe, which is pockets of opportunity in the cannabis space. Cannabis industry that is regulated at the state level. There are small ways to identify geographies that can make for a great retail asset, right? Like I am intent on helping my clients win the 2 dispensary licenses in Redondo Beach, just south of LAX, because I know based on regional dynamics, those are going to be the only stores open for 5 years, and I want my clients to win those licenses, right?
Great.
There's that piece of it, but there's also like if you're working with a brand, helping them understand the architecture of different markets. Like, okay, you want to go into Illinois. Here's the players that exist today. Based on the licensing structure, these are the retailers that will scale over time. How do you pick your business partners in a way that is attentive to the regulatory dynamics, right? Like, how do you think about who will have a 5-store footprint in Ohio and who is well positioned to succeed in the world that it goes adult use, and how you can scale with those operators? So that kind of sifting through all the noise to find the opportunity is what excites me.
And you work in every state, right?
Yeah, I've done substantive work in probably like a dozen states. More work in probably like a dozen of the core larger states. But yeah, operate all over.
Cool. Yeah.
Beautiful. That's fabulous. So wow, this was an amazing show.
Yeah,
It was very
I
so
learned a
informative.
lot.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that much, and I'm really excited about if descheduling could help from a 280 perspective or rescheduling, that would be amazing for cannabis operators. That's
It'd be huge.
game changer.
Yeah. And I have to answer the question that we ask each and every guest. If you had a strain of weed named after you, what would it be called?
Yeah, it would be called, Mugs, Mugs, and Mugs. So a lot of jazz musicians during sort of like the Renaissance of jazz in the early 20th century, that was their code name for cannabis. And Louis Armstrong, who I'm a great admirer of, used to be heard, as you may know, great cannabis enthusiast. And there's a beautiful song, by the way, called Muggles by Louis Armstrong. So if you get a chance, like smoke a joint with that song, Muggles.
I'll listen to it later.
Yeah.
I
know that song.
It's funny because like we call weed mots, I've always called weed mots my whole life. Like who's got the mots? Like, do you have sours? Do you have the mots? So like even my pledge name was mots in college. So mots stuck with me, my whole life, and like that's the name of our dispensary is mots. So like it's cool. And Mugs would be a good name for a dispensary too.
Yeah.
Come to Mugs. It's almost like come to Cheers.
Yeah.
Where everyone knows your name.
Yeah. Louis Armstrong, from Queens.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Where do you live? Right next to you?
Jackson Heights. Right next to where I live in Astoria.
Nice, cool.
Love Louis, man.
Well,
Love Louis. He
We
inspires me
appreciate
to
you.
love cannabis. So yeah,
He
love Louis Armstrong.
inspires you still to this day?
Yeah, I mean, he's just a really incredible person. Obviously, he's a very talented musician. Anyone who's familiar with the songs, but his sense of optimism in the face of like really deep racism in the early 20th century, his love for the cannabis plant just when cannabis was legalized, his spirit. I mean, everyone knows the song "What a Wonderful World," but that really reflects the way he approached life, and cannabis was a big part of it. So I'm proud that he loved the plant, and I'm proud to love it with him. You know, so.
Awesome.
That's
I'm
fabulous.
gonna smoke a joint listening to one of his songs tonight now.
Louis
Yeah.
Armstrong. Everybody should listen.
Well, we appreciate you coming on, Hirsch. Thanks for everything, and good seeing you again.
Yeah, we'll see you again.
I really enjoyed this.
Take care.
Thanks.
Yeah, us too. And we're done.